When the dust settled after the Civil War, the American West lay open like an unwritten page. Beyond the 100th meridian stretched a vast ocean of grass, a land of staggering distances and merciless skies that had defied agriculture for as long as memory served. Yet, within a single generation, this country would be broken to the plow. Between 1865 and 1900, more land was brought under cultivation in the United States than in all the centuries before it combined. This is the story of the men and women who turned that wilderness into wheat, who planted families in soil that had never known a furrow, and who paid for every harvest with a coin minted from sweat, loneliness, and an obstinate kind of hope. The great engine that drove this migration was the Homestead Act of 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln in the darkest year of the war. It promised 160 acres of public land to any citizen or any immigrant who intended to become one, who would file a claim, live upon the land for 5 years, and improve it. The price was a small filing fee and the labor of one's own body. To the landless tenant farmer of the East, to the crowded peasant of Germany or Scandinavia, to the freedman seeking a place beyond the reach of his former masters, this was an offer that seemed almost too generous to be real. By the railroad's careful design and the government's earnest encouragement, the word spread across continents. Free land in America, yours for the taking. They came in their hundreds of thousands. They came in wagons piled high with everything a household required to begin life anew: the iron stove and the seed grain, the family Bible and the spinning wheel, the children perched atop the bedding. They came by railroad to the end of the line, and then walked, leading their oxen across grass that brushed the bellies of the beasts. The land they claimed was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. In the eastern plains, the tall grass prairie rolled in green wades under a sky so large it pressed upon the spirit. Farther west, the short-grass country was drier, harder, a place where rain was a rumor and the wind never ceased its mournful work. The first and most pressing problem was shelter, and here the frontier exacted its first hard lesson. There were no trees. A family accustomed to building in timber found themselves on a treeless plain with winter bearing down, and so they built with the only material at hand, the earth itself. The sod house became the emblem of the prairie homestead. Using a special plow to cut the tough, root-bound turf into bricks roughly a foot wide and several inches thick, settlers stacked these blocks grass-side down to raise walls 2 and 3 feet thick. A soddy was dark and damp. Rain turned the roof to mud that dripped for days after the storm had passed, and snakes and insects made themselves at home in the walls. Yet the sod house was warm in winter and cool in the brutal summer, and it cost nothing but labor. Families lived in these earthen dwellings for years, sometimes a decade or more, before the prosperity of a few good harvests allowed them to build in milled lumber, hauled at great expense from the nearest railhead. Breaking the prairie was a battle against the land's own defenses. The native grasses had spent millennia weaving a dense mat of roots, the famous prairie sod, so tough that an ordinary plow could not cut it. The breakthrough, quite literally, came from John Deere's steel plow and the heavy breaking plows that followed, drawn by teams of oxen straining against the soil. The first furrow turned with a sound settlers never forgot, a continuous ripping as the blade severed roots that had held the earth for 10,000 years. The newly turned sod could not be planted to wheat in its first season. It had to weather and rot. So farmers planted sod corn, dropping kernels into gashes cut in the upturned turf, and waited for the prairie to surrender its hold. Only in the second year did the ground become true farmland. The crop that came to define the frontier wheat belt was hard winter wheat, and its arrival owed much to immigrants who carried not only their hopes, but their seed. German-speaking Mennonites from the Russian steppes settled the Kansas plains in the 1870s, bringing with them a hardy variety called Turkey Red, sown in autumn so that it might establish its roots before winter and ripen early in the summer before the worst of the drought. This wheat, suited to the climate as the old soft varieties never were, transformed Kansas and Nebraska into the breadbasket of a growing nation. Around it grew an entire economy of grain elevators, flour mills, and the railroads that carried the harvest east to feed the cities. Yet no account of frontier farming can ignore the relentless catalog of disasters that stalked the homesteader. The plains were a country of extremes, and the settlers stood naked before them. Drought was the constant dread, for a single rainless summer could wither a whole year's labor in the field and leave a family facing winter with empty bins. Prairie fires, born of a single lightning strike or careless spark, swept across the dry grass faster than a horse could run, devouring crops, livestock, and homes in a wall of flame. Hailstorms flattened standing grain in minutes. Blizzards of unimaginable ferocity, like the great storm of 1888 that caught schoolchildren on their way home, buried the land and froze the unwary where they stood. But of all the plagues, none struck such terror as the grasshoppers. In the mid-1870s, vast swarms of Rocky Mountain locusts descended upon the plains in clouds that darkened the sun and could be heard approaching like a distant freight train. They came in numbers beyond counting, settling upon the fields and devouring everything green, the wheat and the corn, the garden vegetables, even the wool from sheep and the wooden handles of tools where sweat had soaked them. A prosperous farm could be stripped to bare earth in a single afternoon. Families who had labored for years watched their entire livelihood consumed in hours and could do nothing but listen to the dreadful chewing of a million tiny jaws. Many were ruined. Many gave up and turned their wagons back east, the bitter joke of the time being the sign painted on a departing wagon: "In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted." For those who endured, life settled into a rhythm dictated entirely by the seasons and the sun. The frontier farm was a world of ceaseless labor in which every member of the family bore a share. The man broke the sod, planted and harvested, tended the stock, and fought the endless war against weather and pest. The woman's domain was no less demanding. She cooked over an open hearth or a temperamental stove, hauled water from a distant creek or a hand-dug well, made soap and candles and clothing, tended the garden and the poultry that often stood between the family and starvation, and bore and raised the children who were themselves set to work as soon as they could walk a furrow or gather eggs. Medical help lay days away, and women gave birth and buried their infants with only their neighbors, if there were any, to comfort them. Loneliness was perhaps the cruelest tax of all. On the open plains, a family might live miles from its nearest neighbor, and a woman could pass weeks without seeing another adult face beyond her own household. The wind that never stopped, the horizon that never changed, the isolation that pressed in with the falling dark, these wore upon the spirit in ways that left their mark. Some, particularly the women, torn from settled communities and set down in the vast silence, did not survive the strain with their reason intact. And yet, community was built where it could be. Neighbors gathered for barn raisings and harvests, for weddings and funerals, and the occasional dance that lit the prairie night with rare joy. The country schoolhouse and the small frame church, when at last they rose, became the beating hearts of scattered settlements. The composition of the frontier itself reflected the breadth of the promise. The plains became a patchwork of peoples speaking a dozen tongues. Norwegians and Swedes settled the Dakotas. Germans clustered across Nebraska and Kansas. Czechs and Bohemians built their own enclaves, and black homesteaders, known as exodusters, fled the violence of the post-Reconstruction South to found communities like Nicodemus, Kansas, where they might at last own the ground beneath their feet. Each group carried its own customs, its foods and festivals and faith. And though hardship made strange neighbors of them all, the prairies slowly forged from this mingling a distinctly American rural culture. The diet was plain and monotonous, built upon what the land could yield: cornbread and salt pork, beans and potatoes, wild game when the hunting was good, and bread when the wheat held out. Coffee was a luxury, often stretched with roasted grain, and fresh fruit a rare delight. Survival, not abundance, was the measure of a good year. The technology of farming did not stand still, and the late century brought tools that began to ease the homesteader's burden. The greatest of these, perhaps, was barbed wire, patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874. In a land without timber for fences, this cheap twisted wire allowed farmers to enclose their fields and protect their crops from roaming cattle, and in doing so, it quietly ended the era of the open range. Windmills harnessed the one resource the plains never lacked, pumping precious water from deep underground to slake the thirst of stock and family. Mechanical reapers, binders, and the great steam threshing machines that traveled from farm to farm at harvest time multiplied what a single family could bring in, even as they drew the farmer ever deeper into a web of debt and dependence on distant markets. For that was the final, sobering truth of frontier agriculture. The independent yeoman of Jefferson's dream found himself, by century's end, at the mercy of forces he could neither see nor control. He borrowed to buy machinery and land, and the mortgage payments fell due whether the rain came or not. He shipped his grain on railroads whose rates he could not bargain, and sold into a global market whose prices were set in Chicago and Liverpool. When wheat prices collapsed in the 1890s, the farmer who had broken the wilderness with his own hands found that he could not break even. Out of this anguish grew the populist movement, a political revolt of the embattled farmer against banks and railroads and the gold standard, a cry of pain from the people who had fed the nation. When the 19th century closed, the frontier that the Census Bureau had once mapped as a line of settlement was officially declared gone. The grassland sea had been conquered, fenced, plowed, and planted. The cost had been immense, measured in failed claims and abandoned soddies, in children buried on the prairie and dreams that withered with the wheat. But the achievement was undeniable. A continent had been brought under cultivation, and the descendants of those who came in wagons would inherit some of the most productive farmland on earth. The men and women of the frontier were not heroes in the storybook sense. They were ordinary people who endured extraordinary hardship, who broke the land and were sometimes broken by it, and who left behind, in the furrows of the American heartland, the deepest mark any people can leave: the transformation of the wild into the home.